Hello and welcome to this video in which we go over using the Maroczy Bind as a way to fight the Accelerated Dragon. Maroczy Bind is an important pawn structure. It also comes up in some other openings such as the King's Indian defense, but the primary time it happens is against the Accelerated Dragon. We will start by looking at the opening moves. I'll explain the ideas of what each side is trying to achieve with them. Then we'll look at some middle game positions and we'll go over the plans for both white and black. So let's jump right to the positions. Okay, so we'll start by going over some of the initial moves in the Accelerated Dragon. White starts with e4, black plays c5, white plays knight to f3, black plays knight to c6, pawn to d4, take, take, and here we have the defining move of the Accelerated Dragon, which is pawn to g6. Now in the regular dragon, typically white tries to attack this opening with a very, very aggressive approach. They might castle queenside and just attack black on the castle of the king. However, the Accelerated Dragon, this plan doesn't really work. And the reason is that in the regular dragon, black starts by playing d6 on move 2, and then later on they want to play d5 anyway. And this takes 2 moves to move the pawn 2. They could have done that in one shot. What black is trying to do with this opening is they are trying to save that one tempo by playing d7 to d5 directly so that they don't have to waste time stopping on d6. Thus, white usually will take a more positional approach, a little bit less tactical, a little bit less going for the throat as a way to counter this. What they'll do, the strongest thing to do, is to play pawn to c4, and this sets up what's called the Maroczy Bind. And the idea is that by playing the Maroczy Bind, white will never allow black to play d5 because they're controlling the d5 square so many times. The only way that black could really ever realistically try to play pawn to d5, which they'll do once in a while, but it's not a really common thing that they're able to achieve this. They could consider playing pawn to e6 to support the d5 push, and then later on they get d5 in. However, this is not usually very possible. One problem is even if they do manage to achieve all of this, they are likely going to be left with a weak pawn in the end of things. So usually what black will try to do is more slowly undermine the pawn center. So for example, they might try a6 and then supporting the pawn push to pawn to b5. If they're able to get a pawn to b5, they might trade off this c pawn and then they'd be able to play d5 because the pawn would be gone. So then there's some other ideas that they'll also do where they allow us to keep the Maroczy Bind, but we'll see that this Maroczy Bind is not very good for this one piece, our bishop. And so this is often an approach that black will use as well. So, okay, so this is the initial setup. Black usually continues with knight to f6. We defend our pawn. Then they will come out with their bishop. And this creates a threat. There is a discovered threat on our knight. If they move their knight on f6 somewhere, then they will in fact win the d4 knight, so they'll win a piece probably as a possibility. So if, for example, we made a move like bishop to e2, instead of castling, black could take on e4. After we take back, then they take our knight, and black is really just having an amazing position. They're up by a pawn. This knight is actually going to be really, really irritating to ever get rid of. Game is not over, let's say, because humans will make lots of mistakes, but from a computer perspective, game is more or less over at this point. So once they bring the bishop to g7, our cue is almost every time we're going to immediately play bishop to e3. Then they castle. There is a line where they can start by playing knight to g4, which at first, if you've never seen it before, it looks like it's a blunder because we could just take the knight. But the thing is, the queen moving there now no longer defends our knight. So they'll take, and then the thing to remember is to pop back. There are some more details on this line. If you were getting it a lot, you would want to start studying it more, but this is a little bit of a sideline. After castle, we move our bishop to e2, pawn to d6, castle, and all these moves are kind of normal moves in the sense that we're making pretty typical developing moves. Here, one idea for white is to play their queen to d2. Black will perhaps take, and then bishop to c6. The idea of bishop to c6, it's putting some pressure on the e4 pawn, and so we probably play f3. And this is a very typical position for the Maroczy Bind. There are some pros and cons for both sides here. The main pro for white is that white has more space. They have 2 pawns on the 4th rank. Black only has 1 pawn on the 3rd rank. I guess they also have their g6 pawn, but that's not really contributing much to the space. So white has more space to put their pieces. This means that black, if they're going to try to maneuver from one side of the board to the other, it will be more difficult compared with what white is trying to do. Black has traded 1 piece, so that was helpful that they were able to trade their off a pair of knights. But what black is going to try to do is eventually achieve the d5 pawn break. This doesn't look very easy to do at the moment because we have our Maroczy Bind that's fighting against it. But one of the things that they might try to do is to move their pawn to a6, and then later on they'll try to support the b5 push. So they might do moves like rook to b8, maybe the queen will come to a5, and then eventually they'll support pawn to b5 enough times so that they're able to support it. They'll then trade those pawns, and then next they'll have a chance to be able to play d5 because they will have removed our important c pawn, which was fighting against the pawn to d5 push. So this is one idea for black. Another idea for black that they'll try to do is to push their pawn to a5. So this is a completely different plan. And this plan, what they're trying to do is actually install a knight on the c5 square. So their goal is to end up with a very strong knight at the end that we cannot remove. We'll look at how that can transpire. Usually after they play a5, almost an automatic move should be to play the pawn to b3. This way you will have a better chance to prevent pawn to a4. A very bad move would be to actually move your pawn to a3. This looks like it could be useful for stopping the idea of knight to c5 because we could push our pawn to b4. The problem is that black is going to respond with pawn to a4, and now because of the en passant rule, we're never going to be able to play our pawn to b4 ourselves. If we did, they would just capture it, and then their knight on c5 would be permanently good. So actually they're just going to keep their knight over here. So this sort of wraps up the general opening sequence of moves. It's worth reviewing the main line a little bit, but actually the specific moves can often be different in terms of the order that they happen. This is just a rough sense of what the moves are. What we're going to look at next is the plans that each side has. In a lot of ways, that's much more important than memorizing the specific sequence. Apart from the couple tricks that we saw in there, this plans are the more important part. We said that one of the main advantages that white has is that white has more space. When you have a position where you have more space, one of the most important things to do is keep control of the position. What that means is try to figure out what your opponent is trying to do and make sure that you don't allow them a trick to remove your space or somehow take advantage of the fact that perhaps you've overextended your pieces or your pawns a little bit. And we're going to look at a couple of the different tricks that black can do to try to take advantage of the fact that we have pushed our pawns so far forward and maybe we've gone a little bit too far. The first one is just a trick to remember that we always want to make sure that we hang on to this bishop. We do not want to give up our dark square bishop. We are not actually happy to trade it for even their fianchettoed bishop. This is a difference compared with the regular dragon. But we really don't want to trade our bishop for a knight. That would be very, very bad. So our dark square bishop for a knight. So as an example here, a very poor move would be queen to d2. If we moved our queen to d2, this would allow black to play knight to g4, and our bishop's not going to get away. We can't move the bishop because that would drop our d4 knight, and we're thus forced to make a very unfavorable exchange. Black is already doing quite well. I think according to the computer, it's equal, but this would be a case where black is definitely on the better side of equals. So never fall for this. If you play a lot of blitz games, you will eventually fall for this and it'll happen. But always make sure in a serious game that knight to g4, getting this bishop is not an option. Worth noting, if we started by playing bishop e2, castle, and then we played queen to d2, now knight g4 is not so much of a threat. because we can make this trade with giving up our light colored bishop for the knight. Normally, we would say, okay, this is not so great. We gave up our bishop pair, but as we're going to see in a moment, the light colored bishop is actually our biggest problem piece in this opening. That's because our pawns are on c4 and e4. Those are the same color as the light colored bishop, and so we don't want to. This bishop is the piece that is the most problematic for us. So we're okay with making that trade if that happens. What we're not okay with is giving up the dark colored bishop for the knight, because this bishop is a very, very important piece for us. Another thing that black is trying to do in this opening, and this happens in particular when they've pushed their pawn to a5, is they're trying to set up what we would call a dark colored bind. So in this position, which is really a dream position for black, they're not winning, the game is not over, but they're definitely doing quite well. They have put a knight on to c5, and that's the only minor piece that they have, and our only minor piece is our light colored bishop. Our light colored bishop is ramming into its own pawns, and it also can't do anything against that knight on c5. So if white decided to, let's say, capture our queen, this would just open up the a file for our rook, or for black's rook, and so this would be really good for black. Thus, that means that white kind of needs to tolerate this queen being on b4. That's kind of annoying. The queen is not a piece that you can really very easily play around. White could maybe try to do things like play pawn to a3, and then maybe pawn to b4, and this would be their plan. This is what they probably aim to do. I would expect white to play queen to b2 with this idea in mind, but this is not really what white is looking for. Black is very, very happy with this. If we rewind to see how this kind of thing happened, and we'll go back to the position that we'd had. So black has just captured our knight on d4, we recaptured, and as we go, they go for the a5 plan, we play pawn to b3, they move knight to d7, and I would say that this is actually the start of a bad plan for white. So they exchanged their dark colored bishop. So it's very natural, we might think, because in a lot of openings, it is a goal that you trade the fianchetto bishop, and this would then lead to an attack for the white side. Maybe they can start throwing their pawns forward. In the regular dragon, that's a pretty common plan, in fact. In the accelerated dragon, it's not really so common, and this bishop is really needed to fight for the dark squares on the queen side. And so giving up this bishop, usually not the best idea. So if we proceed a little bit further, just on how this set up, and this is not to say these are the best moves from either side. In fact, they're not really very good moves for white. That's why they got into trouble, but they're normal looking moves. They're not terrible or anything. Then the next mistake white makes is giving up this knight prematurely. So they played their knight to d5 thinking, oh wow, this is a great square for my knight. It is a very good square for the knight, which is why black will immediately just take it. One of the things that we want to do in the accelerated dragon, when we have the Maroczy Bind structure, we want to be patient in terms of when we put our knight to d5. It's almost certainly going to be captured at that point. We want to make sure that when it's captured, first of all, we're always going to have a choice over which pawn to recapture with. That puts black in a little bit of trouble because we could arrange our pieces to prepare, in a sense, both of them. Because black doesn't have very much space, they're not really going to be able to fight both options at once. Once we've played our knight to d5, then they know, okay, they recaptured, e takes d5. Well, now in this case, the biggest problem I have is this weak pawn on e7. If we choose to recapture this way, then the biggest thing black has to worry about is the open c file. Once we've thrown our knight to d5 and then made the capture, we've committed to one of those plans. So a key idea for white is to keep their options open so that they will make black respond to both. And what I mean by this is, for example, slowly building up some pressure on the files. So maybe, for example, putting a piece on the e file already, so that way when you were to recapture, you'd already have a piece there. I realize I just put the queen on e3, but we would try to move our pieces around a little bit so that once we make this capture, it would be much easier to get to the e7 pawn. Another example would be moving this bishop out of the way. so that way it was faster to throw our pieces onto the e file. So white is rushing to put their knight onto d5. That's not a good plan, because once we do that, now we're going to be left with our bad bishop against their good knight. And so they play their knight to c5, and this is how we get to this sort of thing. So main things for white to remember here, don't trade the dark color bishop. Usually not a good plan. Very often what you would want to do in this situation, instead of trading the dark color bishop, actually just retreat the bishop, just go back. The one tempo is not nearly as important as the fact that you don't have a bishop. Secondly, don't rush to put your knight onto d5. Once you do that, it's just going to be taken. You want to make sure that when that happens, that you've prepared by having your pieces on whichever file you're planning to open, perhaps keeping the idea of both directions as a possibility can help also, because black will sort of struggle to defend against both options because they don't have the space to maneuver. Last thing just to point out about the dark colored bishops, when we got to this position that we started with, where the queen was very irritating on b4 and we can't get rid of it, imagine if we have our dark colored bishop. This is a much easier thing to get rid of. We would just play our bishop to d2, attack the queen, and then that's it. So meanwhile, the bishop on g7, it looks like it's a really good bishop because it has a lot of space, but there's nothing really for it to attack that's over there. And so that bishop would not be making as much of a difference to black. Okay, so we've looked at a lot of the tricks and the ideas from black's perspective. Let's look at some of the things that white is trying to do. So in this position, black looks like they're trying to support the b5 push, and maybe they have. So they might think, okay, we're going to play b5. Here we have a really cool trick that is pretty relevant in the Accelerated Dragon, that we notice the queens, they're aligned with each other, and actually we can make a great move, knight to d5. Looks like, okay, what's the big deal? We're just going to trade off queens. But now we have the key move that we do not simply recapture the queen. We click in this check. Knight takes e7 check. King moves over, and that means we recapture. So we've won a pawn from this. So this is an important thing to notice, that we can do this kind of trick. Often what happens is that black will, before playing this, have to make a preparatory move, like move the rook out of the way somewhere. If they were to have their rook on any other square besides f8, then this would have worked out okay for black, because after we captured on e7, they could move their king to f8, which would attack our knight. And then that means that when we recaptured the queen, they would take our knight. So this often forces black to lose a move before they can do this ideal thing. And that move is important because it can give us more time to prevent their plan of playing b5. So this is a trick to watch out for when they're looking for a quick pawn to b5 break. Very often our queens can end up aligned. Also, when this happens, they might choose to retreat the queen. That could be an option. But now the problem, there's a couple problems. First of all, we have bishop to b6. But even if we didn't have that tactic, we could in fact just capture on f6, and this kind of structure is horrible for black. Of course, they're losing this pawn immediately, but even if somehow they weren't, they have their pawns all over the place. This is a very kind of loose pawn. They have doubled pawn here. This is isolated pawn on open file. Also, their rooks are quite bad. So this is one trick for white. A different approach for white is a more modern approach, and it involves, instead of moving the pawn to f3, to move the pawn to h3 instead. And this is a different way of stopping the knight g4 idea. And the advantage of this is that it keeps our options open, that we might later on want to play our pawn to f4. It also allows us to have more maneuverability for our bishop, which is the problematic piece in a lot of those lines, along this diagonal. So the play might continue, for example, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop c6, and now instead of playing the pawn to f3, this would be really weakening on all these dark squares here. I would expect that eventually, it'll take some time, but I would expect that eventually black will move their knight, move their bishop, maybe move their pawn, move their queen out, and they're going to infiltrate there. The structure of playing pawn to f3 and pawn to h3 together really doesn't work very well. So instead of playing that, also instead of playing bishop to f3, which could be all right, it's not as bad as pawn to f3, but problem that might happen is that this bishop still is kind of a little bit awkward here. It's blocking the f pawn. We would play queen to c2 to defend the pawn. And this kind of thing would be a different approach. Something also to realize is that they cannot go for this tactic, because if they go for this tactic with the discovery, we actually would just take their bishop first. And so there's not any trick there. Of course, if we recaptured, then this would work out great for them because they'd have won the pawn. We saw that trick before with that discovered attack, but here it doesn't quite work. So this is a different way that white can try to approach the position. It's not to say it's better or worse, just a different approach. Okay, so here we'll just make a summary of some of the ideas for white and black. So white in the Maroczy bind has more space. That means two things. They are trying to avoid trades because trades will allow the side with less space to have enough space for their pieces. The issue with not having space is that your pieces are not able to maneuver, and they often want to be on the exact same squares as each other. So the side with less space usually wants to make trades. So white often tries to prevent these trades. Black will try to either go for a plan with pawn to a6 and pawn to b5. If they go for this plan, what they're trying to do eventually is either achieve the pawn to d5 break because they've removed our c4 pawn, or sometimes after doing this trade, they can just have really active pieces on the queen file, on the queen side, for example, on the a file. The other plan black can try to do is move their pawn to a5, and in this plan, what they're trying to do is put their knight on c5, and this knight would be difficult to remove. What white is trying to do is keep the pieces on. They will eventually try to play a3 and b4 as a way to control the c5 square. Usually, because of the en passant challenge, that means they have to start with pawn to b3, then pawn to a3, and then pawn to b4, because if they played pawn to a3 first, this is where we saw black could respond with pawn to a4 and control this with en passant. Now, one main thing for white is that they're really trying to stop the ideas of black. So white initially is trying to just keep control of the position. They're not going for any sorts of tactics. They're not so much trying to, they are advancing their own plans, but not in a very direct way. They're advancing their own plans in the sense that they're moving their pieces towards the middle. They're maybe playing moves like rook to c1, rook to d1. Sometimes you could do rook to e1. They're watching out to make sure they prevent the knight to g4 trick. They are playing pawn to b3 as a way to prevent this pawn from going all the way to a4. This is what white is trying to do initially. And once white takes control, very often black, they can't keep kind of moving things around forever. Black will eventually, in many cases, lash out. This might be with something like moving their pawn to f5. That's a breaking maneuver. Pawn to f5, though, is something that is much riskier for black as far as pawn breaks go compared with pawn to b5, because pawn to f5 is loose around the king. So usually what you're trying to do as white is be patient, try to set up all your pieces in the right place. Eventually, you can put your knight onto d5 if really nothing has happened, and then after some favorable exchange, maybe you could invade on either the c file or work on the backwards e7 pawn. But as white, you're really trying to keep control of the position. Once you get that control, very, very slowly, keep trying to improve your pieces a little bit. And then usually it won't come to it. Usually black will lash out with a move like f5, which opens up their own king position, and then your pieces are all ready to go for it. If they don't ever lash out, if black is sort of playing this waiting game and being patient as well, eventually you'll have an opportunity to either play knight d5. Occasionally you can also maybe do something like pawn to f4 and go for a kingside attack, because in this case black is really not doing anything. So that about wraps up things for the Accelerated Dragon. If you have any questions about it, thank you first of all for watching this whole video, but if you have any questions about it, feel free to ask them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, see you next time.